Of the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman. This, to me, very simple little poem, not much regarded, but I just love this poem. It's just 6 lines, and it just seems to be the essence of poetry, both what it says and in itself. And it's called Beginning My Studies. Beginning my studies, the first step pleased me so much. The mere fact consciousness, these forms, the power of motion, the least insect or animal, the senses, eyesight, love. The first step, I say, awed me and pleased me so much. I have hardly gone and hardly wish to go any farther, but stop and loiter all the time to sing it in ecstatic songs.
What's it called again?
It's called Beginning My Studies, and if you just look at one of those typical paperback editions of Whitman, which print usually the last 1891 edition, it'll just be in the first 5 or 6 pages somewhere. It's just a tiny little poem. Now, I'm going to read my own book, and I'm going to try to give you a flavor of it, sort of like Collins said. And he actually read something that I wrote about it that kind of introduces it, and, you know, I thought, say, that was pretty good. I don't remember understanding what I was doing that well. Did I really say that to somebody? But apparently I did. So I'm pleased with that. But of course, when you give the idea of something, you get a sound that is very ideational. I hope that the poem itself is more concrete and emotional and physical. One of the things that I'd say about it is one of the things that Colin mentions, a dimension of it, is that the modern world is all over my poems, whether you're talking about factories or computers or atom bombs or whatever, or whether you're talking about the issues and the way we think about these things. Like, for instance, like Tennyson was thinking about pollution way back in 1840 when writing that poem. We think about Armageddon and the last man on earth and all this kind of stuff. All these kinds of things are all over my poems, but then they also want to be, at the same time, the kind of Orphic, ecstatic poem, maybe the little short poem like the one by Whitman that I just read, or a poem by Juan Ramon Jimenez or somebody like that. And so this book has not refined out of it all the modern world, but it's more like an attempt to use almost the kind of imagery you get in the Gospels or something, you know, sheep and vines and so on. In this case, the desert and associated things. The desert giving you pure extent and pure light, pure gold and pure blue, and an attempt to take a vacation, as it were, or prescind from all of what I've just been talking about, and write about the sort of existential or spiritual essence of our situation. Hopkins says there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. He talks about pollution, and he says, yet for all that nature is never spent, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And if you think, if the last man in a totally poisoned world sees a flower, the whole world is reborn and present. The freshness of it is there, even in his last gasp. I'm trying to grasp something like this in a lot of these poems. And I think from the evidence of the poems you read, so are you trying to grasp the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of sections if I can fit them in, okay? Part 1. Whenever you stop or slow, restlessness stoops and drives you. Then, going on, you feel your legs again, heavy and stiff with wear. They used to carry you, now you haul them, damp logs that flicker with pains. You feel your back crumbling from the blows and slippage of your heels in the sand. Only the extreme end of day pleases anymore. When the caravan imposes its halt after sundown in the music of gradually subsiding purple, and the first stars appear mute over the flat round. Then, tired to death, you can fall asleep, and there's pleasure in knowing your great heaviness sinking into a greater. So long we've been traveling across the sand, heat, and panicking light that the journey's motion, slow rocking of our hips as the feet fall and slip, the rhythm of the stubborn elderly camels and donkeys, the motion of the journey as night begins to freeze, becomes the rest we thought we longed for. Our motionless bodies in motionless beds, the slow ceasing bellows of our sides, motion of a journey that has reached a rest it earned or seized, or in a night without stars or wind has died. The motion of a journey that has turned to rest, that continues in the form of rest. The poet says, the death man fears is only the death of sleep he dies every night. But you wake up from the sleep of death in the middle of every night and feel you are dying, intolerable fear, and no one coming. You long for hated dawn and to be on the way again. The other sleep. It's in the dead of night only that you wake up, in the dark between the stars and the sun, night exhausted, dawn not yet. Only then is attention real, godlike. Then it sees how far it is from being God. It sees, in a darkness blacker than the young night's beautiful color, known at last now in nostalgia, a blackness darker than light in pure space. Then you recognize the journey in which your bed is an evening's pause. It's the house of this moment in which the journey is a dream. You got up and wrote down in such a dead of night the beginning of your story, 3 lines. A child sat on the green hillside in sun and shade and cursed God for the death of the beloved earth, and felt love in skin, nerves, and hair as the day passed over. But then it grew clear that this was not the beginning. And each new night, adding a step toward death, as people say, brought out of you a preface to your preface of yesterday. Lines of an earlier tomorrow, dim lines of a moister brightness, a further groping toward the first spring, deeper in the past, the unspoiled, a walking of the other direction, taking the road back the way you came, another step toward where the dawn begins. The music of the night, the poet says, is not in the stars but in the darkness there between them. For the stars, then, the dark is their desert, as the blinding desert is the dark for the traveler. who pitches his rag of tatters on the sand and seems to freeze in place for the night, and with the returning light, go on again. If man, the poet says, is dust, this thing that walks through the dry expanse is a man. The splendor, painful dazzle, and monotony of the desert, always equal. A day of walking, a month discloses nothing new and nothing old. When you were a child under the trees, one footstep brought you to a fresh world, newly born, drenched in memory. Now, no advance from where the last step was planted. Sand, the ruin of soil. The next place is the same. That instant when the heels struck and sunk far back there, a yard ago, already glowed with every brilliance of earth and our whole futility. The sky and sun were unveiled there once and for all, blue and gold, their true bodies, their true names. With morning, all the labor and pain to come, all the fading dead, nevertheless you had a taste for the new day. You had lived that morning before in a deep valley outside of time. There, the walls that blocked us in were forest and stony wooded ridge with threads of cascade, not openness to a circular horizon over low dunes. There a river came from and went to unknown places and brought fish, frogs and turtles, birds, lilies and arrowroot, rhythm and melody, trees, willows overhanging shelves of the banks for children to be shaded, watching trout and sunfish drift through the water grass. The caravans of the merchants, Valente writes, las caravanas de los mercaderes. And I wonder, look up in wonder at the street. And does it matter that the merchants' caravans are trucks, huge tractors, Freightliner, Peterbilt, International, Western Star, and giant cartons with lettuces and cornucopias of loaves painted 2 stories high along their sides, big screen stills from a movie of abundance, signs of the wealth being hauled to us, threatening to fall over, to crush us like a comber, a leaning wall, as the truck strains to bend around a right-angle corner and we step back and think of Anais Nin, all at once knowing herself woman, small, as she walked next to passing truck tires twice her height. Of Juan Ramon, in childhood he saw 3 oxen taller at the shoulder than the highest roof tiles of the village, giant oxen of life and vision. This world is another. I think of a boy in Babylon, lying on his bed, calm but vibrating in aftermath pleasure, just having come from his friends, their jokes, their easy strength. Never again, he thinks in exultation, will a moment be like ours. This style of grace, the subtle transformations, ours alone in this incomparable language that we make with every expedition for love with the girls, our happy prodding, their happy defiance. A moment supreme till time ends, a moment of a world, our youth, our invention, constant, condensed in a song, and always living in a next moment, another day. Never was there in the world, nor will there be, this agile splendor and flow. He swells, as our saying goes, with pride, and looking up at the cars, backpacks, cell phones, and the trucks of the merchants, I agree with him. I am him. When the heel strikes the sand, a chasm opens in thought. Why not stay here and mine for water? For the spring of this dryness, the hidden or unreal moisture that you feel here, gathering to pour from its absence into the blindingness. When the same heel strikes, a thirst arises to go on, to find the spring anywhere out of here. A sense of new strength arises. Now, as your gaze travels far ahead of you into bluish dust, this time you won't forget. This time you will keep the place and the promise. I'm going to skip to section 3 and read it, and that'll be the end of my reading. So this, we go on through the desert, and there's 10 sections in the book. The desert keeps getting resurrected, but it gradually disappears. And especially in section 3 and 9, that element advertised in the sixth poem, the beginning of your story, 3 lines, a child sat on the green hillside. This gets picked up. And chapter 3, just like that story about the trucks, you're suddenly out of the desert. There's a sort of narrative and realistic intrusion in the basically symbolic, surrealistic landscape. Well, perhaps the biggest one of those in the book is section 3, which is a sort of narrative section, kind of based on my family and my life to a certain extent, though all changed way around. So, and it starts with an introductory poem about just driving around in the beautiful landscape of a place like Ontario or Ohio, right neighboring where I'm from, and just driving around and seeing it. So you're surveying the ground that you sprang up from, right? In the mirages of silver, as I drive the late summer country roads, lakes of dazzle on the sun-absorbing and refusing asphalt in the rich, well-watered land, my home, the roads, my only desert, and my way into the thickets and clearings of this beauty. As I pass by the aisles of willows along streams, the woodlots of the prosperous farms, my car engulfed in shade in a long tree tunnel of maples with the white clover perfume blowing in the windows between the tiger lilies of the ditches and sweet pea and faintly violet convolvulus twining on wooden fence posts and black fence wires, the brown and white of 6 couched Holsteins, 2 black horses grazing motionless far away, and the spray of golden mustard flowers on the slope where Father took me to chase butterflies. I remember the end of my house. The hooves hollow on the parched August ground that night beyond the walls. What was it out there approaching? We crept down from the bedrooms, my mother, father, and I, moved toward the window, but first the door broke open. 4 men ran in, my uncles, my mother's brothers. They took her screaming, took me screaming, shot Father. We were tied struggling in heavy ropes, gagged, loaded on the flat, low-sided wagon, and carted like pigs of iron or sacks of lettuces. 2 uncles rode before, 2 behind, their rifles butted on their thighs, muzzles high, and their men on each side with the torches they'd brought to the house. Torches put out now to pass along invisible as our procession entered the silent town. So now the Howes had her back, as they'd always sworn, from Liberatore, the filthy Catholic, the filthy farmer. For 6 years I had lived happily in the meadows, stream banks, woods, and fields. The world sparkled, the nights were kind, and filled me with eagerness for the new day. The only dark was a child's faint awareness of the other family in the town, never visited, scarcely ever seen. Sometimes we'd go past their offices, a cube of brick in the town they'd named for themselves, or see their mill on the creek bank back of the row of stores, and Mother would repeat that these belonged to her family and name her father, who had been her friend. I'd seen the squat church with a low crenellated tower where they were founders and elders. I remember an ancient silo clad in tile, white once, now brown, like an old man's teeth, and covered in vines. We had passed it in our wagon, Father and me, on who knows what never repeated errand, and I had no notion where it was, but I always remembered it in my child mind's map, which lacked all exact location, but in mysteries corresponded exactly to that land. The tower stood forever, an enchanted monument of a splendor fallen long ago, somewhere in the world around us. The house had been like that to me. Strange fires somewhere, strange shapes of mute blackened buildings, until that night when I was dragged to live with them and be their son. They were the law there. The law there. As soon as I heard and got this idea, law, I thought that law had been the fields when I was small, and the seasons, and Father DeVry coming out a long way to bless them in the midst of planting time in the name of the Madonna. A May altar with the mother and child clay statue, with lilac sprigs and lilies of the valley from our yard and kitchen garden, where Father had a way of ranking the vegetables in rows behind each other, a secret way his own, so that the rabbits were discouraged. Bring flowers of the fairest from garden and woodland and hillside and vale. The law then was Father on his wagon, sometimes me beside him, coming back from the farther fields with wheat, at other seasons turnips or potatoes, which were new then. I remember the excitement of the new crop. I remember the bean flowers and twining sweet pea. O Mary, we crown thee with blossoms. All this had been the law. So now I saw things newly, law, and then another law that drives the first one out, the succession of laws, which is history, which is forgetting and decay. September, the wandering workers used to come, and Father would hire his 3 to help bring in wheat, oats, and barley, and finish the hay. Evenings, Mother and the other women rode out from town, and at trestle tables fed all the hands hired by the farms round about. Then the men slept in the barns. 2 weeks of heaven, more heaven still than the others. The strange workmen, skin dark and marled as river stones, speaking purling tongues, their bodies knotted and small, almost as small as mine, but tireless, powerful, like gnomes and trolls. From far away to see Father with them out in the fields, the crystalline sky enclosing. A cloud passes across. Father bows his face to the earth, and around us, in the circle, the shy, distant meadowlarks and bluebirds, dragonflies by the muddy banks, their beloved home, orioles in the top of the hornbeams dividing the meadows, gray kingbirds I'd meet on fragrant paths in the woods. Mother was uncontrollable. They shut her in, so she closed herself in her room, except to plant and tend some flowers, closely watched, around the back door, near where the water pump stood on a small porch with woven open-work walls, green painted. I remember her lilac bush like the one there had been by the back door of our house. After 5 years of this, she died in my 11th and became a memory, more in my body than in my mind. Her care for a child, succor, as they call it, and then 5 clear years of rages sinking into ghostliness. The same June, sex rose in me. I had been made a how, and silently I hated everything, except my wandering, which gradually returned as they came to trust me, or rather ignore, the useless boy with books, who went back to them soon after any barrage of shouts and kicks. The one who did what he was told, did all his homework, got his A's without a word, without a sign of desire or resentment. But by the stream again at last, under the willows and oaks, watching the water lilies and the bass slipping between them, the flights of goldfinches and grasshoppers, finding the small snake and the mantis, stopping to read in a hut-sized hall of green the brush had woven of itself in the woods, friends with the tanager and blue jay. There was no denying the ancient delight of my skin, my sight, my smell and hearing. I could not understand the way the birds, the thick green, and the light of the sky mixed in me, or did not mix, merely dwelt, merely abided, side by side with the broken stones of the Howe's old mill race from their patriarch Daniel's time, when the one furnace turned out a poor ton of spongy iron a day. And side by side, too, with the might of the new factory. I'd sit by the creek and look up at it on the opposite bank, long, high, black, at night sending a blue-orange glow into the dark. While the crickets and cicadas chirred in my ears, I'd stare and feel pride, knowing it was mine, it could be mine, and I could go within there whenever I wanted, had often been there, watching, a chosen son, as the ladle tipped molten steel into the molds, and the men, heavy-booted and visored, stood back from the sparks. Father hadn't been killed. He recovered and lived a shadow life, impotent of justice, out there in the beauty where the shaded house backed on the stream, and Mother's lilac continued to bloom. I took to visiting him in the freedom of the ever-deepening indifference around me. I'd walk out along the creek bank, or later along the rails, then cut across the fields. How strange to walk the railway, the ugly backs of buildings, then out into the open, the blue and gray slag underfoot, flying grasshoppers rising, unfolding their black and gold, and to each side the wild wheat, ironweed, milkweed, tiger lily, as your eye squints from the dazzle off the polished rails, and you struggle to fit your steps to the narrow, slightly uneven rhythm of the ties. Father still drove his wagon to his farther fields. Sometimes I'd sit by him again, help load and unload. There were neighbors now, and he'd hand them out cabbages, carrots, beans. In the evening he'd play an Italian song on the juice harp, then maybe sing it softly. I didn't know a word. In the fall he'd have one cow butchered and take the hide to be cured and make his own shoes from it out in the shed. Everything as it had been. Then one day the Howe's police chief came and said he had hanged himself. What would it be to take a sufficient revenge to burn everything? To walk away from the flaming town in the music of the screams out into the desert the heat has made of the earth? And is it a fool's game, a coward's, to burn it down in words? Words that can't help bringing human and divine wisdom with them, since they are partly made of those. And so they prevent the burning, except in fugitive images, because the just must not suffer with the unjust. For 30 years, I never went back. By then, the town was empty. The Howes, my uncles, had died. The family had vanished into a few teachers and waitresses with other names, names of humble husbands. The headquarters building, mainly empty, housed one tattoo parlor in the south corner fronting the street, next to the white brick Catholic church and the stained glass window Father had donated, Christ welcoming the children. The cement approaches to the main factory were cracked by flowering weeds, chicory, and tall dandelions. The hangar doors sagged open. Mourning doves sheltered and cooed inside. I drove out to the farm, left the car by the long drive, a short road really, through the near field, the house's grove, and the wide yard. Walking up, I passed under the hanging tree, the old oak alone on the lawn, now gone wild in front of the porch. I saw that where he had hung, underneath, there was a sour, yellow circle where nothing grew, a circle of white and damp short grass that seemed to have sprung and died and matted together and rotted all at once. So I stood in the circle. First the cicadas chirred around me, and beyond the oak shade, the green tips of the young wheat sparkled blue, and waves of breezes ran across them. Then I heard a faint crying. Was it words or just a sound? A man whimpering, sobs, disconnected gulps. Sometimes it seemed the sounds were saying, "Help me, help me," and then they disappeared. Or was it that I stepped back terrified out of their world onto the good green clover? I paused there for my breath to start and stepped forward again. The paintless house with its broken windows and doors sagging open, with the treetops along the stream shining behind it. And in the circle the faint voice came again. As long as I stood there it came, wordless, something like, "Help me," sometimes maybe a phrase in my lost Italian. Oh, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Answer a few questions from the audience?
Yeah, so Colin and the others had asked me, and I'd be very happy to discuss anything that anyone's interested in. I know it's hard sometimes to, with the poetry or any art, to come up with thoughts and so on. So, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm very curious about the story that you just read. It's the Section 3, the kidnapping by the Howe family. What's the background in that?
Well, it's the background's twofold. You might think this way, like if you read Zorba the Greek and you went over to Greece, you would not expect to find Zorba. He doesn't exist. But you would expect to find Greece just like Kazantzakis described it, and you would find it. So the foreground story is a story made up and family members across several generations put into it, but the plot comes from a couple of paragraphs, or a long paragraph in Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, where an old friend of Jude is telling him about the tragic history of some of his ancestors that he's never known about. So the idea of the kidnapping by the relatives to take away the baby, and in Hardy's little story narration in Jude the Obscure, the baby dies. So I've changed it around in various ways. But then things like the Catholic-Protestant division, the idea of the Catholics still to a great extent representing the ancient medieval earth-centered rhythmical culture, and the Protestants being very, very involved in industrialism and so forth. Some of the suicides and things like that, the landscape, the behavior of the boy, even though if you look at this, to look at the story closely as you would need to look at it, you could see it's sort of like a dream, in that it spans 2 or 3 generations. The person is alive, as it were, in, maybe 1880 or something like that, but he's also alive in 1960 or 1970 in a way that's impossible. So he's a person that sort of spans these and brings all this together very, very condensed, sort of. So, in other words, there's autobiographical and regional background that's quite true. There's incidents that are distorted but based on true ones. And there's an overarching plot that's based on an idea I got from Thomas Hardy. Okay? So, yes?
Would you please come back with me to 1954 and be my English professor?
Now, why is that? What was wrong with the 1954 English professor? I'm sure he was a wonderful person.
Well, there's a difference.
Well, that's a great compliment. In 1954, I would have been like 7, and so I was already very interested in poetry, but sort of as an illiterature, just hearing the Psalms in church and things like this, or children's rhymes, Yes?
Over what period of time did you write the book, and can you talk a little bit about how it evolved?
Yes. Oh, okay. That to me is interesting. My practice, I've written, as Colin mentioned, by now quite a few books. My practice has always been, often on purpose, sometimes almost accidentally, to not publish anything in a book very soon after it's written. And in fact, most of my books, there's at least 8 years between the book's publication date and the original drafting of the most recent poem in it. However, I've written recently a couple that are more or less contemporary, published more or less contemporaneously with their writing. That is, I was writing them up to, a year before they were published, and even revising them more recently than that, as recently as you could. You've got to close the book up 6 months or something before, because of production necessities. So I had the idea, I have had all these poems that I could make into various books, and I was working on that, but I had this idea that was very close to me, and I wanted to write this book sequence because of my love of the sequential poems, my love of certain authors, of course, my subject matter, and my heart feeling about it. And I thought I would try to write something that was as close as you could get to actually telling somebody the story or spilling out the songs, just like a real spontaneous singer. Now, of course, that's only a metaphor, because I'm very much a perfectionist, and everything in there is worked over and over again by myself and with the help of others. But still in all, it's a pretty recent book. I would say it started about 2.5 years ago. Then the other interesting thing to me about it is I had about 1 year ago open heart surgery for an aortal valve replacement. I have a condition called stenosis, which I've been under observation for about 13 years, and I had to have this finally fixed. I'm blessed they can fix it now. And so I was telling people that I was up here, right here, to go to a conference about Jacques Ellul over at Carleton's philosophy department in July. So the great surgeon said to me, so when should we do this operation? The cardiologist sent to me, and I thought I was going to consult. But he just, as soon as I came in, he said, so when are we going to do this operation? He was going to do it immediately. I said, I'm signed up for this conference on my favorite thinker, and he said, okay, go to that. You're probably not going to die during that, and we'll do it when you come back. So it was in August. It was the beginning of August, and so it was time for the book. And Nancy wanted my book in this season, and so I was working to finish it right up to the operation. And then after the operation, as soon as I had any strength, had a couple of good hours a day, I then was working on the perfecting of it, responding to the editor's suggestions, taking things out, putting them in, finding parts that I had discarded, which now seem they should be in, discarding parts that I had included, and doing all that stuff, to get it just right, how it is. And so this straddled the heart operation. So I look back at it, and people will ask me, what influence did that have, I don't know, but it must have had some influence. And it was certainly a blessed thing to have as an occupation while going through all this. So I don't know what to say about it. It's just a little piece of autobiography, but you'll have to be the poets of it. You'll have to interpret it, but it was moving to me. So that was a circumstance of its writing, So. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I will just end then by just making a comment connecting back to what Colin said, and some of it he quoted from me. The book has obviously got its own emotional subjects and its physical subjects, like its walking, seeing things, the great interests of man, I think, looking, smelling, sensing the world around you. The inexhaustible passion of that, but it's intellectual too, and that title sequence and the way it goes along with each page. There's 5 or 6 poems that go on to a second page, but basically each page, which is usually only this long or this long, being a poem by itself. Almost all of them could be separate, and yet still depending on the whole, it is partly to represent or make a point of how poetry actually parallels in its basic form our own life, the succession of our days and the other moments of our life. So a day is a complete unit, and I would say a step, a breath is a complete unit, and it finishes and it ends, and yet it goes on and is connected to the next thing too. I think that this is a great mystery to us because of the dominant intellectuality of our day, science. We have trouble thinking that reality is not basically the flow of energy and forces and the construction of things out of the mass of stuff, of the atoms, and so on, and that the individual is unimportant. Now, it's certainly true that the individual changes and goes like ripples on a stream, and yet, in my philosophy, the individual is supreme reality. And all the things that science finds only exist in, as, and for the individual thing, so that the stable form, even though mysteriously it is never really stable, is still the supreme reality. And I think the poem, in a sense, inherently represents this, but the book is supposed to, in its form, make it more specific and intense, right? So, you know, I feel often a lonely prophet. I really feel on this important philosophically matter, the whole arrow of modern intellectuality is pointed in the wrong direction. So that's how I'd close, okay?